Good morning and welcome to WCAT. I'm Kiki Latimer and I'm your host for the Catholic Bookworm and the author of Home for the Homily, Seeing God's Face, amongst other things. And we have with us today Ann Garrido, who's written a very interesting book called Let's Talk About Truth. Let me see if I can hold it up here. Here we go. And with the subtitle of A Guide for Preachers, Teachers, and Other Catholic Leaders in a World of Doubt and Discord, which we have plenty of. It was fun. I wrote Home for the Homily, and it was fun to see where our two books intersected, which was really fun, which we can talk about. But welcome. And I'm going to have you start us off with a prayer.
Sure, Kiki. Thank you for inviting me to do so. I was thinking a little bit, one of the places where the Gospels speak about truth most is from the Gospel of John. So maybe we could just read a short passage from there.
Go for it.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, we know that on that night before you died, you spoke about sending a spirit of truth into our lives. So we hold up these words as we begin our interview today. These words of promise. When the Spirit of truth comes, he will guide you into all the truth. For he will not speak on his own, but will speak whatever he hears, and he will declare to you the things that are to come. He will glorify me, because he will take what is mine and declare it to you. Lord, as we gather for this hour with each other, we ask that that Spirit of truth might swirl in the space in which we gather and permeate everything that we talk about, and help us during this hour to experience you. We ask this in the name of Jesus and the power of the Spirit. Amen.
Thank you. Well, here we are just a couple of days post-Pentecost, which is exciting.
Yeah, it's all about the coming of the Spirit, right?
Yes.
Right.
So great timing for this. It's kind of interesting. I wasn't aware of that when we picked this date, but works well.
As it often does, doesn't it?
It does. It's very interesting. So, your book started with this idea of truth with a small t and truth with a capital T, which I thought was really helpful. Why don't you give us a little information, insight into that to start us off?
Sure. I think one of the challenges that we're facing in society right now is that oftentimes we're using the word truth in a whole lot of different ways, and we're not necessarily really clear about what it is about it. And sometimes we step into the pulpit or into the classroom to begin to talk about truth, but with a very empowered definition of what truth actually is. And it's similar to if I were to step into the pulpit and preach about that God is love into a community whose definition of love has been shaped a lot by the experience of like horrible domestic abuse or something like that. That what they're hearing when I say the word love isn't what actually we would be wanting to talk about as Catholic love or Christian love. And so similarly with truth, until we have a fuller or richer understanding of what that word might hold, just to go up and begin to talk about truth or God as truth or the Bible as true or Jesus as true, even the Spirit of truth, we're not always, we need to sit first about like, what do we actually mean by that word truth before we begin to try to always connect it with God or Christ. So that's part of what I wanted to do. I'm not going to get into in the book big like kind of doctrinal issues or anything like that. I'm more talking about what do we actually mean by the word truth?
Well, I mean, we have a situation to begin with where, in a relativistic society where people say, what's true for you is true for you, and what's true for me is true for me.
Right.
Kind of breaks down when it gets to mathematics, where 2 + 2 appears to be 4 for everybody. Yeah, it is difficult. I find the concept of truth difficult even just in very basic conversations with people. where this relativism, where truth is kind of fluffy. You have Pilate all around us saying, what is truth, everywhere. Used to be just one of them, but now he's got friends in high and low places,
Yeah, and all of us, I mean, in some ways, Pilate's question is what all of us are wrestling right now. What do we actually mean? What do you mean by truth? Yeah.
One of the things, that we hear, I teach ethics, and one of the things the kids will say, of course, is, who's to decide what's true? And trying to explain that in itself is I call it a false question, because nobody decides what is true. I say to them, nobody decides that 2 + 2 is 4. We discover that 2 + 2 is 4. The truth is there all along. We discover that giraffes exist, or certain things about the world, so that the idea of who's to decide is simply a false question.
Sure. And the definition of truth that I hear you working out of there is really the first definition of truth that I go into in the book, which is the definition of truth as having a mind aligned with reality. It's kind of that classical sense of truth in the work of Thomas Aquinas, based even earlier on the work of Aristotle, right? That what our goal in life is to have a mind that's aligned with reality. So that, as you're saying, discernment, our brain is always trying to discern the facts of the world, and that we can't go any further in truth if we first don't try to have a brain that's aligned with reality, to discover what is real.
So if someone says, well, there's a very big concept in our society that we create our own reality. I loved the story that you had of, where was it there, on between the Canadian.
Oh, I think I know which one you're talking about. Yeah, that's one of my favorite. It's probably an urban legend, ironically, so it's probably not true in that sense, but I think it's revelatory in the sense that it's a story of the U.S. military. I think it's supposed to take place off the foggy coast of Newfoundland, in conversation with the Canadian authorities, and the Canadians say to the U.S. military, "We recommend you divert your course 10 degrees to the north to avoid a collision." And the Americans come back and they say, we recommend you divert your course 10 degrees to the north to avoid a collision. And the Canadians come back, "This is very urgent, divert now." Americans come back and say, "Look, we are the U.S. naval force. We have a aircraft carrier, 12 defense ships. We've got a whole bunch of support vessels around us. You must divert your course 10 degrees to the north now, or countermeasures will be undertaken to ensure the safety of our fleet." And there's this pause, and the Canadians come back on and said, "We're a lighthouse, your call." So I mean, it's the sense that reality is what it is.
Reality check.
Or not. The challenge with that is that reality being what it is, we're the ones that are in danger of a terrible crash if our minds aren't aligned with reality. So it's not the world that's in danger. It's we are in danger if our minds aren't aligned with reality. Yeah. So before anything else, that has to be in place.
And we see situations where, people we could use, Pope Francis has used the term shipwrecks, which is interesting in light of this analogy. But that people whose lives become shipwrecks because they're not aligned with reality.
Sure.
Which is very, very sad.
Sure.
So we're talking about real consequences in people's lives if something's not, aligned with reality. I spent this past winter working with a woman who, during the pandemic, was pregnant with twin baby girls, and just in a moment of panic in what she thought was the reality of, abortion is a simple answer, and I can't handle a pregnancy right now, and I'm terrified, and nobody stepped forward with any other forms of truth. And so she went with that and and aborted the girls, and then, had to live with the shipwreck that followed that. So truth matters. Truth matters, like in really concrete ways. I think sometimes when people get into the idea philosophically of truth, that it's kind of a fuzzy thing. It stays like fluffy and philosophical, and oh yeah, that's fun to think about. But truth matters concretely in our lives because we make decisions based upon what we believe to be true.
Yes. And I'm very sorry to hear that happened.
Mm.
I think one of the distinctions that I draw in the book is that oftentimes when we're talking about truth as objective, as it is what it is, there's two things I guess that I would want to add as maybe nuances in that. One is that truth is objective. It is what it is, like what we've been talking about. But also that reality and having a mind aligned with reality is very, very big. So as one of my Dominican colleagues has said to me, and I just have loved this line, he said, reality is like a bazillion volts of electricity. Our brains are like 60-watt bulbs. So what our brains are actually able to hold of the immensity of reality is still very tiny. And so that we have to also have humility before truth, in the sense that we have to recognize that what we do know of reality or what we do grasp of reality is so small in comparison to the hugeness of reality that in many ways what we are going to hold is going to be, in some sense, we could say less true than it is true, in the sense that there's always going to be more for us to learn. And sometimes we might, as the case that you're talking about right there, act with a small piece of reality that we have, rather than really an openness to the fullness of reality. So are we always trying to learn more and get a fuller picture around things in some ways before we make really important decisions, knowing that we're not going to ever be able to have all the information that we wish that we had before we made a decision, but that having information and being open to getting more information, not just sticking with our own personal experience of things, is important. The other thing which I might make a distinction with is that when we're talking about objectivity of reality in that sense, what we're talking about is the existence or the non-existence of things. Like you gave the example earlier, it's like, well, whether there's a giraffe there or not, that's not a matter of judgment. That's like either it is or it isn't there, and it's a question of whether my mind is aligned with that or not. When we begin to talk about what we should or we shouldn't do in response to a situation, that is, we're beginning to move into what I would call a second category of truth, which is the formation of judgment. So this would be a little bit different about whether this exists or this doesn't exist, whether the ship is there or whether it's a lighthouse or not. But what should I do in response to the reality that I'm finding myself in? That sometimes that requires a slightly different skill set. And especially in the world that we live in, which, as you noted, is a pluralistic environment. There's a lot of different judgments that are around us. How do we discern between judgments and how do we discern between facts? Both absolutely critical for living a good quality moral life. And those two things, they're a little bit different, aren't they? And so when we're trying to combine them under the same umbrella, sometimes I think that's what makes some of the conversations that we're having as a society so sticky.
Well, you mentioned humility. I always talk about humility and prudence as humility being the virtue that undergirds all the other virtues, and then prudence, the one that overarches.
Oh, lovely.
Because, humility, again, like you're saying, to realize like we're going to get a small piece of the puzzle here.
Right.
Our minds are that 60-watt bulb compared to the trillions of, stuff that's possible to bring in. But then all of a sudden, when we get information, prudence, like, doing the right thing at the right time in the right way, I always say, you might know that like asking forgiveness is the right thing in a particular situation. But how you go about doing that or whether you do it, and in what manner, that that requires prudence,
Yeah.
Yes, I should be a loving person, but how can I love this person the way they need to be loved, not the way I necessarily want to love them or how I want to be loved. Those decisions are very difficult. Yeah.
They are, aren't they? And one of my favorite images of prudence, it came from, gosh, it was a piece of artwork I want to say that I saw in Italy once, but it was the image of prudence. And I want to say she held a snake, which I oftentimes think of the snake, like it can wind in a lot of different ways, but it knows where it wants to go. And I'm not talking about snake here in an evil way. I'm just talking about like the way that snakes move was an association with prudence. And I think that the image, so if I talk about truth as having a mind aligned with reality, another definition of truth that we could say is having a mind aligned with what's good. And which is like we could think about in the gospel sense that I have come that you may have a fullness of life in abundance. So if that's the good that we're shooting for, a fullness of life in abundance, there might be a number of different ways that we might think we're going to get there. And even Aquinas himself says that people of goodwill might make different prudential judgments. They might have a different idea about how to get to the good. The goal is, though, that first off, we have to agree that we are seeking good. There are many other things that we might seek as well as human beings, but living truthfully, living a spirituality of truth means having a mind that's aligned with the good and that our actions are trying to move toward the good.
Yeah. I was fascinated years ago. I was taking a course with Father Milady at Holy Apostles College, and he talked about the idea that let's say we have this man, a husband who's a family, he's been convicted of a crime. And he talked about how it's proper for the wife and the children to be praying for mercy and that he gets a light sentence, and for the judge to be praying for justice, that he might get a heavier sentence. And that they're both praying properly. And I was fascinated by that. Yeah. They were both praying properly because of how they're connected to this man. That was fascinating to me, that they're both seeking the good, but from different points of view, not relativistically. They're both real and they're both true, and they're both related to the good, but just proper to their relationships with him. And that fascinated me. It made me see that, the good, the true, and the beautiful is very complex.
Oh, for sure. For sure. I was just thinking of, for the book that I'm working on right now, I was doing some research on some Jewish midrash, and one of the stories that was in there, and this is like from the Jewish tradition, was that they said that the world that we live in is actually the third world God created. The first world was that God created a world that was pure, it was totally just, and that ended up being a very harsh and joyless place. And then God was not pleased with that, so God wiped that away. And the next world that God created was a world that was purely mercy. And that what ended up happening was that when people saw what their neighbors were doing, they descended very quickly into chaos. And so God had to get rid of that. And that the third world, the world that we live in, is the world that God created with the right balance of justice and mercy. And that this is the world that gave God the greatest joy. Like this is the world in which a fullness of life can happen. And now, obviously, it's not scripture, but it's kind of within the Jewish tradition. I think they're wrestling with the same thing you're wrestling with right there in that story, that there's both the world that God created is justice and mercy.
From our point of view, there's such a distinction between justice and mercy also. But obviously in God, his justice is his mercy, and his mercy is his justice. There's no distinction in God between the two.
Yeah.
We have to wrestle between, the two, but because we're so limited. But to God, they're one and the same. So I don't think we got a chance to the difference between the small T truth and the big T truth. Is that clear?
I'm not sure I really went into that in the book.
Do you want to?
I think what I would just say is that before we begin to talk about big T truth, like before we begin to apply the language of truth to God or to Christ or to scripture or to church, I think it's important for us to have a robust concept of what small truth, T truth means. And that's really what I'm trying to talk about in this book, is giving ourselves the opportunity to sink deeply into the multiple different ways that our own tradition talks about the word truth and what living truth means. That's what I was trying to get into here. Yeah.
But we live in this world of a lot of skepticism, a lot of doubt. Obviously, you know, your book is directed toward teachers and preachers, because we're dealing with audiences that, you know, we're dealing with an audience of pilots saying, what is truth? And I'm not sure we can reach truth. So what is your advice on that? Because we have all this doubt about all sorts of things. I mean, Bishop Barron right now is reaching out with the talk about the doubt people have about the Eucharist, about the real presence in the Eucharist, for example. There's skepticism, doubt, and preachers right now are trying to reach certainly the Catholic audience with the truth that no, Jesus is really there. But they are dealing with doubt, skepticism, relativism, you know, any kind of bucket you want to put it into.
Yeah, and I appreciate you bringing up skepticism. You brought up earlier relativism, which is the thought that if anybody believes something is true, it must somehow be true. Skepticism in some ways is almost the opposite of that, which is that there is such a thing as truth, but it so doubts our capacity to be able to apprehend it that we go into a world of doubt about our own capacity to know anything. So it's almost like if I can't know everything, then I can't know anything at all. And gosh,
why bother?
I'm sorry?
Or why bother?
Why bother to try? Because it's going to be because I'll never be sure that I've really got it. I think for many of us in academia, that probably is a real challenge. And for many of us living in the modern world, for me, that is a real challenge, because I do acknowledge that reality is so big and that I might not have grasped the fullness. I know I haven't grasped the fullness of it. That then it becomes very hard to take a very strong stand on anything at all. And the challenge with that is the challenge with skepticism is that we can begin to then just get stuck in kind of a spiral of doubt that makes it hard to act. One of my favorite lines from the philosopher Wittgenstein, he says, if every morning I wake up and I have to ask, do I really have two hands, or is that a figment of my imagination? You know, it's going to be hard to move on with one's day. Right? Because you're going to have a hard time, like, is that really a car that's coming down the road? Can I cross the road? Or is that just a figment of my imagination? We get kind of paralyzed or frozen. And I think what we've oftentimes seen is people who are unable to make decisions, unable to take stands, because they feel like I will never know quite enough. I think one of the great dangers we saw during COVID, for example, was all kinds of people were like, well, I can't trust medical researchers. I can't trust the people who are in charge of the CDC. I need to do research myself. And part of that is an absence of humility, as we talked about earlier, because even if I'm doing, quote, research myself, I'm not a lab scientist. I'm not in there being able to do tests myself. All of us are going to have to be able to make decisions based on trust of what other people have said based on their areas of expertise. And if I don't have any humility to trust other people's expertise who have a lot more knowledge in this area than I do. Do they know all things? No, but they have a lot more knowledge than I do. That is going to be very difficult for us to be able to move forward as society. Now, part of the reason why people have a hard time trusting others' expertise, and maybe we'll want to get into this next, is because so often people have been lied to, which is kind of this another way of thinking about truth. That whenever we're lied to, it fractures our capacity to be able then to believe things to be true. So in a society where there's been so many lies in the last years, is it any wonder that we're going to begin to doubt everything? Even the things that, like you're saying, are really, really important for us to be able to grasp.
Yeah, I mean, we have this amazing crisis that we're living through right now, I believe, with the media. We don't trust the media, or we don't know. We trust some in the media, and we don't trust others. We're not sure whom to trust. It's very interesting because as you say, there's been so many lies, and maybe this particular media source hasn't lied, but these other ones, the others have. So that's a concern. I mean, I talked a lot during the pandemic that, I basically had a trust in the CDC as to what they were saying concerning COVID. But at the same time, I could go to their website and they told me that abortion was good and, a good, healthy thing to do. So I'm like, well, that's interesting, So on one hand, they're saying some things are good that I wholeheartedly believe isn't. And it's just part of a, huge lie. On the other hand, I'm trying to trust what they're telling me about COVID and vaccines, etc. So I've personally found that difficult to trust, somebody that I know is lying about X, to trust them on Y.
Yeah. And again, I think it's this question of a distinction. I haven't checked the CDC website on this. What it says on abortion. But whether it says, that's interesting that it would say that's a good. I'd have to look that up.
Well, it's safe, a safe procedure. It's safe,
okay.
It's safe, legal, blah, blah, blah. The usual, abortion rhetoric is there, that this is a safe procedure.
So part of it would have to be like, so what's your definition of safe? And that definition might be different than my definition.
So abortion is safe and the vaccine is safe. And I'm sitting there going, yeah, well, I had the vaccines, but and didn't have the abortion, but when you have that coming from the same source, where we're trying to make trusting decisions.
That's one of the things that makes
life, and about life, and about, important issues of life. And so you have these conflicting things. I think we do wind up with a crisis of truth.
And it sounds like even in your own life, it's one of the things that's been a source of confusion.
Oh, always. Yeah, because truth is important to me.
Right.
And of course I teach teenagers about truth. I teach an ethics and metaphysics course with homeschoolers right now. And teenagers are like brutally honest about truth and their desire to know what it is.
And so one of the things which I like to try to do when there's a real when there is confusion is not to actually, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, not get into a battle of no, this is true, no, this is true, but to talk a little bit about, how did you arrive at the conclusion that you arrived at? So what you were saying, for example, with stuff with the media, where are you getting your information about that? Tell me a little bit more about why that source means so much to you, or why that particular source is one that you've come to trust. So I think as a society, one of the things that will help us in the sense of confusion, not necessarily give us answers, but help make the conversations less clogged or knotted, is to begin to be able to be more self-reflective on where did that come from? Where did that come from? Or how did I arrive at my conclusion here? One of the things I'm working on right now with Renew International, which is a great thing, which is being funded. They received some grant funding from the USCCB, blessedly, to work on a discussion guide for getting Catholics together to talk about how we're going to talk about the fact that we think about these things differently, that we're seeing these things differently, to have more constructive conversations about them. Because as you're noting, sometimes when we try, it just ends up getting just confused and knotted, and it doesn't feel like we're making a lot of progress on it. We end up almost more confused after than before.
One of the things that's fascinated me over the years is the strength, again, going back to my philosophical things, the idea that I was brought into is the idea that you should temper your belief to the evidence. Okay. So, the more evidence you have, the stronger your sense of belief should be. And the less evidence you have, take it a little easy on your level of belief. but I see this everywhere. My husband and I kind of joke about it, that people hold extremely strong convictions, extremely strong, on things they have almost no evidence at all, or unreliable sources of information. So, X happens somewhere on the other side of the world. And there's all kinds of reports about it, left and right reports about it. And people jump on the left or right bandwagon very quickly, and they dig into that belief, with like zero humility, and prudence. And they hold that belief strongly. I mean, they'll, fight over it at a cocktail party. And I'll say, like, how can you have such strong convictions about something that you have, this much evidence for and this much evidence against, and you can't, there's really no way to go and ascertain what the truth is, but you're absolutely convinced you have it on both sides of an issue, and it's fascinating to me.
Yeah, I would actually say, and the deeper that I've dug into this topic and working on the book and writing it, which was really quite a lengthy process, I'm much more like comfortable and able in conversations to say, gosh, I don't really know. Let's go look that up, or let's try to find out more information about that. I find myself a little bit less defensive in conversations and more not so much open always to having my opinion changed about stuff, but curious about where my opinion came from, more honest or transparent about that. And then also more curious in conversation with others to ask, not to get into an argument with them, but just to find out a little bit more, why do you hold what you hold? Because often what we hold for some reason, as you keep indicating, because it's important to us, it is linked to some of our core values. And so finding out more about why we hold what we hold, I think often makes for a more interesting conversation than getting into a battle.
I think also it's difficult for all of us to realize how much we're a product of our culture.
Oh, yeah.
Of our environment. And that we're kind of like, especially when we're younger, we're kind of like sponges, soaking up the attitudes of the culture. And sometimes we're completely unaware of it. So of course people are prone to saying, oh, if I lived during the time of slavery, I would have been against slavery. And I was like, well, maybe not if you had a cotton plantation, you wouldn't have been. Or, if I was in Nazi Germany, I would have seen the evils. And it's like, well, I don't think so. Very few people did. And there were a lot of, a handful of people saw it, like von Hildebrand, but most people didn't see it. They thought it was all working out pretty well for the economic good. And they were oblivious to things. So, in our own culture, it's difficult to separate yourself from your culture and say, how much of my belief system have I simply absorbed like a sponge? And
all of us have, right? And that's why I do think it's really important for the pursuit of truth to be, if I'm deeply committed to truth, it does mean that I need to be deeply committed to always being in conversation with people who don't hold the same truths as I hold, like hold the same perspectives and same worldview that I hold. Because when we're engaged in that, again, it doesn't mean I need to be persuaded by the conversation or change my mind from what I hold, but it always continues to widen me just a little bit more to the wider reality and the multiplicity of different ways that people are making sense of reality in their minds. It's one of the reasons why I think in Catholic tradition, interreligious dialogue has been such an important part of our tradition. For me, being in conversation, I would say a really interesting interlocutor. I've done a lot of work in the Jewish community. And just looking at how we could have the same scriptures and interpret them or understand them in different ways doesn't mean I become Jewish. What it does mean is that my perspective on how scriptures could be interpreted has been widened forever because of the conversations we've had. And that's been a beautiful thing.
The humility to have conversations with people that think differently, or like you say, interpret something differently. I've been very active in the abortion world and the pro-life world. But at one point, people don't have debates anymore. So my pro-life friend Steve Schwartz and I said, well, why don't we have a debate? Since we can't find a pro-choice person to debate with us, I said, I'll take the pro-choice side and you take the pro-life side, and we'll just do a debate. And he said, no, I'm afraid you'd win. And that's because I know the other side that well. And I could argue both sides. So the ability to understand, like if you're looking for truth, but you don't understand whatever it is, whatever the issue is, whether it's, abortion or capital punishment or the vaccine or whatever, if you're arguing and you're holding on to your position from a point, but you don't know the arguments on the other side, you don't know the issues, you don't know the questions on the other side, then how well informed are you by your own decisions? So the importance of being open, like you're saying, to discussions with people that think differently, is hugely important.
You're making me think of a quote from Aquinas, which I wish I had written down in advance of this. I could find it in front of a book, but I don't want to get up. But basically, Aquinas says we must love those who hold the same opinions we do and those who don't. For both have been in the search of truth, right? And both then are helping us to find it. Now, the thing that I think Aquinas does hold on to there, and which he's very charitable around, is that the other perspective is in the search of truth. And I think one of the challenges that we've seen, you mentioned media, but also politically in the last 10 years, is that sometimes it's hard. Sometimes I'm not sure that always truth has been what the other person was really aiming for. And that's one of the things that makes things really difficult.
Yes.
So if I'm having a hard time trusting that the other person is really seeking truth, that's where you get into with some of the stuff that we've endured politically in terms of lying, just flat out, like you could show like, 13 lies were spoken today. The fact that we haven't, that makes it, whether I should always be grateful for another perspective, I have to at least trust that my interlocutor also loves truth and also is trying to figure out what's true.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we certainly know one of the truths is that not everyone loves truth. Some people prefer money or power,
right,
far more than truth. Question: what would you do? What lie would you tell for $1 million?
Right. And that's why when I get into this in the book a little bit more, I start with the idea of truth as having a mind aligned with reality. I get into what's a mind, and then truth as a mind aligned with what's good. But a third definition of truth that's really important in our Catholic tradition, especially for Aquinas, he said, and the Catechism is very strong on this, truth is also about having a mouth aligned with your mind. Right? Because a lot of us, we could know what's real in here, but what we actually say out of our mouth is a different thing. And so that's where we can't really have truth. It's truth, living a truthful life, living truth is more than just about knowing what's true. It's also making sure that our actions and our words are aligned with what it is that we actually have come to grasp of reality and the good.
And that's where we wind up in confession far more often than we'd like.
Sure. Yeah. Recognizing, because what Aquinas says is that you can't have a functioning society if you can't trust what other people are telling you is true. So, every day we're going to go in the grocery store and we're going to pull a box of cereal off the shelf. And if I got allergies, I got to trust that what is on that list of ingredients is honest to what the person who's putting cereal in the box knows. Or when I drive over a bridge, I got to trust that the architect passed on truthful information to the construction firm, right? Because our lives are lived every single day by 1,000 acts that are trusting acts that what we've been told is true. So if in our society there's anything that is excusing lies, that then what's happening is that we're undermining the foundation for what it makes possible for us to live together, kind of like the Tower of Babel situation. So that the conviction that honesty is important is something I really emphasize strongly in my book.
Are you familiar with Gert's rules?
Oh, tell me about it.
Gert was a philosopher, I believe, who came up with the idea that in order for a society to function, to not have a culture, but just society, you needed a basic set of rules. And starting with, you can't lie, you can't steal, sort of a respect for persons within the group. And every group that's any kind of a society has to have those rules to function at all, not to actually flourish as a culture, but just to bind together as a culture. And honesty and not lying is a big one, is huge in that. And like do not kill, do not steal, do not lie. Those kinds of things are important, because if you don't have those, I tell the kids, all you can do is kind of stay in your cave with your gun and just stay there, because you're afraid you're going to be hurt or lied to, and you don't have any way of knowing what reality is. And then sometimes, people will say, well, what about a bad society, a bad culture? And I say, oh, they have it too, within their own society. So take the Nazis. The kids always bring up the Nazis as a bad society. And I'll say, oh, but they had those rules too for themselves. The Nazis didn't want it. You can't lie to other Nazis. You can't steal from other Nazis. In order to have any kind of a society, good or bad, you start with what I call Gert's rules. These basics.
It's almost like you're naming 10 commandments, right?
It's almost, you start with the 10 commandments. Yeah. You have to have some kind of order. Otherwise, you can't function as a society with disorder. Total chaos is not a society of any sort.
Yeah. And so before we can really enter into dialogue with each other, we could have a variety of I can discuss things with people of different worldviews and different opinions and different judgments than I hold all the time, as long as I can trust that what you're saying is actually what you do believe. So first I need, and now it's very possible that what you believe is not aligned with reality. Right? And that the purpose of conversation, hopefully with each other, is that in the purpose of our conversation and our dialogue is that each of us might more deeply root ourselves into reality. But I do have to trust that what's coming out of your mouth is aligned with what you're actually thinking right now, and that you want truth.
Right.
And then I want truth.
And we sometimes do wind up in situations where we're not, like you're saying, we're not sure that's the case.
Yeah.
That you're not arguing, in good faith. Yeah. And that's difficult, trying to discern that. Yeah. So going back to homily.
Oh,
and preachers for a second, I'd like to bring it back there, because that's how I teach homiletics. I taught homiletics for quite a while. How does and your book mentions preachers and teachers, right? Guide for preachers, teachers, and other leaders. How does the priest or the deacon bring this into homily? This awareness.
I think one of the things I tried to do throughout the book was to give samples of ways that you could bring up some of these themes, this fuller, helping people to develop a fuller commitment to a life of truth through the pulpit. And I also, on my website, I also actually included some sample lesson plans that you could use in high school, with high school students, even into college, middle school. You could probably use them in either direction. Around how would you introduce these concepts in the classroom? I actually think our lectionary, there's a truckload of places. Truckload is not a very great term, but there's an abundance of places in our lectionary where these themes about what truth, how to live truth well, wrestling with questions of truth, do appear. So I'm getting ready right now. On June 1st, the reading of the day is the story of Bartimaeus. And so I've been wrestling with that story again. And kind of like when Bartimaeus says, I want to see, right? So what I do, like, it'd be very appropriate to preach in a homily. This is the direction that I'm taking in my own reflection for that day. It'd be very appropriate to have something around like, oh, look, that deep, deep hunger to see what is that? What is he really talking about there? That it's physical sight. Yes, but there's probably something inside of each and every human being, this longing to be able to see the world and understand it as it really is. Linked back with, like Plato and the character of Timaeus in Plato, who longs to understand the underpinnings of the world. So, like, that's a great example of just a healing story in the daily reading that you could easily, as a preacher, make a connection to. Let me talk a little bit about what this human hunger is to know the real. That's what we're calling truth. So that's, just one example of one place you could. But the lectionary, gosh, there's a lot of different places that could tap into helping to give our congregations a fuller understanding of the Catholic practice of living truth in daily life.
Well, I'm just curious what you would say. I think sometimes people do have this deep hunger for truth, but at the same time, they're terrified of it because, I'm going to have to change my life, I'm going to have to, get rid of X, Y, and Z. I'm going to have to find ways to fill those spaces when I get rid of those things in my life, whether they're addictions or just stuff that's not good. Sometimes truth is terrifying to us. Like we even sort of see what the truth is, but it's so hard.
And I don't know what to do with it. Right. No, I know. That's why I almost like sometimes in my own imagination, Bartimaeus is almost my patron saint for the life of truth. Because I begin to recognize the courage that it takes to be able to say each and every day, I want to see. Because as you're naming right now, sometimes there are things we don't want to see. There are things that are scary when we see them. I can't unsee some things I've seen. Yeah.
I like the my patron saint is the guy at the what is it, the Waters of Meribah there. He's been there for 38 years and he can't get his butt down to the water. That's my patron saint. I love it when Jesus says, do you want to be healed? Like, do you want to be healed? Like, I don't think so, buddy. You've been sitting here for 38 years. You've kind of given up, or you've made 38 years worth of excuses. Like, that's me, I don't really want to be healed. I'm good, Well,
it so parallels like you're talking about in our society. We say we want truth, but do we really want truth? Because you're right, truth has implications for the way we're going to live our lives. And many of us are nervous around that.
Right. And recently I had to go and speak somewhere. I'm not a political person at all, and I recently had to go twice and speak at the State House on this abortion bill, and I was terrified, and I really did not want to get involved at all. I was like, no, God, please don't make me go. And then, it's funny, I always had a vision of you that I always thought courage meant you weren't afraid.
Oh.
I never realized it's the one virtue I think I've been totally confused about, that I never realized it means, no, you're terrified, you're scared out of your skin, but you do it anyway because it's the right thing to do. So I got my whole concept of courage changed recently by, facing a truth that I really did not want to do. It was like, no, God, not me. In the Bible, the guy who says, here I am, Lord, send me. I'm like, here I am, Lord, don't send me.
There's a strong prophetic tradition in the scriptures around that too, right? There's a strong
send somebody else. And then he's like, no, there's only you. So,
Yeah.
So, truth can be scary, and speaking the truth can be terrifying.
Yeah.
I had my grandson with me when I had to speak the first time, and my hands were shaking so badly under the table. He said your voice was strong and clear, but I could not, I tried to pick up the water bottle on the table and I was doing this. I had to put the water bottle back down. And after the talk, my grandson, he's 16, he just took both my hands and set them on his knee and put his hand over my hands just to calm my shaking hands. Because the truth, it's getting there, going to the State House, speaking the truth was terrifying. Wrecked my whole day.
But what a beautiful witness your grandson gave at the end. And that kind of is we shouldn't wrap up without naming the last definition of truth that I give in the book has to do with being true, which is kind of what your grandson was to you in that moment of I'm going to guess your grandson and you probably are aligned with what you were speaking about. Yeah. But for many of us, even though we might not agree on a particular truth, like we might not hold the same perspective on it, might not have reached the same conclusion, there are still ways of being true to each other, being faithful to each other, being present for each other in this in-between time when we still don't have the same vision. And doing things like, as you did, to just hold one another's hands. Yeah. Because I think one of the things that I wrestled with a lot in the writing was a lot of people were telling me, like, we're just stuck in these intractable debates around stuff. And my husband and I were never going to agree on this, or my kids and I we keep talking about it. We're not getting anywhere on it. And the question is, how do we remain true to each other, even when I can't hold the same truths? And that's what I think our current Pope Francis has done such a beautiful job witnessing to the world. Francis, I think his favorite thing to talk about is the parable of the Good Samaritan. Like, if you're to look through his homilies, what he preaches about the most, I think, is the parable of the Good Samaritan. And what he's talking about there is like that the Samaritan who practiced truth in that situation. Like the Levite and the priest on the way to the temple, they might have known a whole lot about, God or truth, but who actually practiced truth in that situation? And he says, of course, it's the Samaritan. That truth, sometimes there's aspects of truth we can glean from a distance by looking at things objectively from far away. But then he also says there's aspects of truth that we're only going to know when we get close to each other, get near to each other. And that also is a form of truth that we need to be schooled in, which is really the school of relationality.
Yeah.
Love.
I have a dear friend. We agree on a zillion things. I find it funny. We look alike, we dress alike. We've both taught courses on silence and the importance of, centering prayer. She's into plants and flowers and photography and you name it. And so we have so much in common. But she's radically pro-choice. And of course, I'm extremely pro-life. And it's caused conflict. But we've agreed to stay friends and we've worked at a friendship. And we have this great respect for everything else in each other's lives. And we've either agreed to disagree or we've agreed to speak about the matter kindly and gently to one another. And if we can't do that, then don't speak at all on the matter and stick to ballet and flowers and birds. And it's really been a good thing, I think, for both of us, because it's taught us that everything in life doesn't have to be an argument, no matter how important it is. You don't have to hate one another over an extremely important disagreement. You can still be a kind and gentle person. And I think that's important. And people have been surprised by the friendship, you know, but I think the friendship is important. And
to me, that is a source of great hope for the world, right? It's like, how do I think what we're striving for as Christians is both, how do I live a life of conviction? I don't want to be wishy-washy. I don't want to not have, firmness of belief. And I want to be open to something wider than myself. And I want to be in relationship with others who don't look at the world the same way. I think all of those are very deep Catholic beliefs. I know one of the things I love about Catholicism is the concept of the both and, right? I want this and I want this and I want this and I want this all at the same time. And what I've heard witnessed to me from you today, just in the hour we've had with each other, is your deep conviction around what you hold, and your openness to friendships with others who don't. I mean, I think that's part of the Catholic witness in the world.
I think so. I mean, one of the things, I mean, I reach out to people quite a bit on Facebook, and again, people are always surprised, like, oh, you're friends with that person? That person's on your list? It's like, yes, because if we're friends, it's like, otherwise you wind up just preaching to the choir.
Right.
If you're friends with just like-minded people, you're never going to change the world. So the importance of having true relationships and friendships and reaching out to people. So I have critter cams, and I post things about my raccoons and my squirrels and my birds, and I reach people on all kinds of ways that aren't, specifically Catholic, specifically religious, but people start to say, oh, I have something in common with Kiki, and I have dialogues and drop off plants for people, and then
This is
somewhere
also why
down.
you're living truth. Right.
Right. And then somewhere down the line, they'll find out, oh, she's Catholic. And they'll have to go, oh, I thought I didn't like Catholics, but she's Catholic. And so that's my prayer, is that they'll put together, something else with that. And somehow that truth will speak for itself. So I think that, we do need to be, I mean, Martin Luther King said, the only way to change an enemy into a friend is through love. And you have to find different ways, St. Paul said, be all things to all people. So finding different ways to enter into relationship with people who are like-minded and not like-minded is so important. And your book really brings that out. I really want to say it. Let me just hold it up here again. I don't know if you have a copy of it there.
I do.
But it's wonderful.
Thank you.
It's really wonderful. It's very easy to read. I really enjoyed reading it. I like the examples you gave. There were exercises, right? It's been a while since I read it.
Yeah. I do have some great discussion questions at the end of each chapter, like for journaling, or even to get into conversations with other people. If I don't want to get into conversations about a particular truth, right, that maybe we don't both hold, but if I want to talk about truth, like how are we going to talk about truth with each other? It's great book for that.
It's really wonderful. So I recommend it. Is there anything you would like to talk about that we haven't touched on before we finish up? I know we're sort of running out of time here.
Maybe I could end on this note. Again, this came from conversations I had with Jewish colleagues. They said that they told me that in Hebrew the word for truth is emet. It's 3 Hebrew letters. And what's interesting about emet is that emet is it's comprised of the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, the middle letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And it's a sense that truth is comprehensive in that regard. It goes from the beginning to the end. It holds all within it. And there's a logic, there's an orderliness to it. One of the things they said, though, is that the Hebrew word for death is the word met. So it's the word emet with one of the letters missing. And I think oftentimes when we talk about truth as Catholics, some of us will excel in one way, one definition of truth. Like we'll excel with having our mind aligned with reality. But as we've just talked about, there's not a lot of charity toward my fellow human beings. Or some of us are deeply loving people, right? We're Samaritans on the side of the road, but we're not always very honest, or sometimes I'm very honest, but my brain's not aligned with reality. So like there's these nuances around truth. And that really, if we want the fullness of life, if we want to really be a person of truth, we can't drop any of those letters, because any of those letters that I drop is a step toward death. Sometimes when I'm watching, like the panel of faces on the news, and it's like, well, what is it like living in a post-truth world? And I want to say, unask that question. That's the wrong question to be asking. there is no such thing as a post-truth world. Either we have truth or we don't have a world. Like we have to be committed to this, or the world is not going to continue to exist. So I want to encourage us as Catholics who have this rich spiritual tradition around truth, not just truths, but truth, to ground ourselves in just deeply committing. I am committed to making sure I have my mind aligned with reality. I'm committed to trying to figure out that my actions be aligned with good. I'm trying to make sure that whatever I say out of my mouth is aligned with what's in my mind. And then I'm trying to be true to relationships. And I don't think we can let any of those drop.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Would you like to end
Good
us
to
with a
talk
prayer?
with you. I'm glad that we finally got the chance to meet. I know it's
Me
been kind of a
too.
wild
Me
spring.
too.
Thank
It
you.
is fun to see where, like I said at the beginning, where our books sort of came together. It was really interesting. Yeah, with your with
Great.
language and having one point in a homily and so many things like that. It was like, oh yeah, I like this.
That's great.
I call it the one egg homily.
The one egg. Okay, I love that term. That'll be great.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for your time. Thanks for reading the book so deeply.
Thank you. Would you like to end us with a prayer?
Oh, sure, sure.
Thank you.
God, you are always good. And we sense that you've been particularly good to us in this past hour. We thank you for the depth of conversation that we've had, the way that your spirit of truth has moved within and among us. And I ask you to continue to bless our day, bless our steps going forward. May the spirit of truth continue to guide us in everything we do and say today. In the name of Jesus, empower the Spirit. Amen.
Thank you so much. Just quickly, where can people get your book? How can they get it?
Oh, sure. Thanks for asking. It's available through Ave Maria Press, which is where I've published most of my work. It is also available on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or Goodreads or wherever else that you're interested in. But definitely the Ave Maria Press site is great. And there's a lot of free resources up there on that website as well. If you Google just Let's Talk About Truth, there's some teacher's guides, there's homily helps, there's a lot of good stuff that's up on that website.
Great. Thank you so much. If I'd known about your book before mine came out, I probably would have quoted from some parts of it. It was really wonderful.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Likewise. But I'm glad we know of each other now. That's fantastic.
Yes, absolutely. Great. Thank you so much.
Okay, take care.